Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin. I want to thank you guys for clicking on this episode. Make sure you hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and comment down and let me know what you think down below. Today, we're going to look at The Dark Side of the Ring, Season 2, Episode 1, both parts of the Chris Benoit story. So let's jump into it. So basically, in part 1, the whole story starts off with them giving us a background of Chris Benoit. Now, throughout this whole documentary, I honestly learned a lot that I didn't know before. Basically, it starts off with how Chris Benoit was inspired by Dynamite Kid at the age of 4, and basically at that moment when he saw Dynamite Kid is when he realized that he wanted to also become a pro wrestler. And being a pro wrestler was the only thing that Chris knew and the only thing that he wanted to do. So after that, it goes into his journey and when he landed in Japan and how he met Eddie Guerrero. Vicky Guerrero talks about how Eddie at first hated Chris Benoit, but eventually they became best of friends. She talks about how Eddie at first couldn't stand Chris Benoit, and that's something that I never knew. I mean, I knew that these guys had a strong friendship, but this documentary, or however you want to call it, it really jumps into it and it lets us know more about them. Also, so after that, it goes more into Chris Benoit and how he was in Japan and how his relationship with Eddie Guerrero and how it grew over the period of time of them working together in matches in Japan. And like I said, at first Eddie says that Eddie told Vicky Guerrero that he wasn't really feeling this guy, and in the end, like I said, they became friends. So one of the good things about this documentary is that it kind of touches base on Nancy, his wife, Chris Benoit's wife, when the tragedy happened, and it really sheds a light on her on a bunch of stuff that I never knew about. It talks about how she became a fan, that she was married to a guy who was a pro wrestling fan, and eventually she divorced him and she met Kevin Sullivan and basically became his manager. I think her first gimmick was Fallen Angel, and basically it was this demonic gimmick that they were doing. And basically that's something that I never knew. I don't know if you guys knew about that, but I personally did not. And it's just awesome that they really touched the light about this and how they were able to go forward with this. They also talked about how then she also became woman in WCW with Kevin Sullivan, because Kevin Sullivan went to WCW, was a booker, and basically Kevin Sullivan ended up basically booking the feud between him and Chris Benoit, which eventually led into Nancy being with Chris, which eventually led to their divorce. It also talks about how Kevin Sullivan was basically abusive towards her, which pushed her towards Chris, and eventually they had the fallout of the divorce that they went through. And it goes from there. From that moment, it goes into basically in WCW, it talks about Chris and what he was able to accomplish and how Chris was kind of upset, him and Eddie and Dean Malenko, and how these guys were upset. Also Chris Jericho as well. They were upset with WCW because they were cruiserweights and they were only able to accomplish so much. So after that, they ended up leaving WCW before the real fall of WCW, and they ended up jumping ships to the WWF. And it talks about how at that moment is when basically Nancy left her career behind to become a stay-at-home mom. Is when they ended up having Daniel, who we all know that he was unfortunately one of the victims of this tragedy, this tragedy murder that ended up taking place. So one thing that really touches base on part 1 is they end up having David Benoit, Chris's son from his first marriage, and he really talks about in part 1, they really, David Benoit, there's also Sandra, who is Nancy's sister. They have Chavo Guerrero, Chris Jericho, Dean Malenko, and they all really shed light on everything that Chris Benoit was, who he was as a husband, as a father, and etc. Talking about how he wasn't, in no way was he ever a troubled person, or never really showed signs at first of trouble in his life, until basically the tragedy that happened first with Eddie Guerrero, and how Eddie Guerrero ended up passing. Now his wife Vicky Guerrero talks about all the struggles that she had to deal with Eddie Guerrero, and then eventually, he overdosed 3 times until he finally got fired from the WWE, which ended up resulting in him cleaning his act. So once Eddie Guerrero ended up dying, that was the moment where it really broke down Chris Benoit, and it really was, unreal to him. Chavo Guerrero talks about how he found Eddie, and basically how Eddie ended up dying in his arms, and when he told Chris just broke down. And ever since that day, that moment, it wasn't, he wasn't ever the same. Chris Jericho talks about how at Eddie Guerrero's funeral, how he basically was crying on Jericho's shoulder, and it was just, Chris Benoit showed emotion, something that not that many people have ever seen. So that's basically what part 1 was, and it's basically like a fight, like a boxing match, or whatever the case is. It shows the good side, it's the good back and forward, and then it gets you ready for that part 2, which is that real, that big uppercut, or that punch to the gut that's really hard. So let's talk now about part 2. So in part 2 is where, it really sinks down, because in part 2 is where they talk about everything that happened, with the murder of Nancy and Daniel, and the suicide that Chris Benoit ended up committing after he ended up killing them. So it starts off with, I think it was a police officer or a welfare officer who the WWE called so they can send somebody to go check, because of course Chris Benoit didn't show up for the event like how he was supposed to. And he basically talks about how when he walked in, and how he found Daniel, and then Nancy, and then eventually Chris. I learned a lot of information, because I was a kid when this happened, so I didn't know what the circumstances were. I heard, as a young kid, that he killed his son and his wife, and then committed suicide, but I never really heard the information on how the scene was. And he really, this guy really broke down the scene and let everybody know how, from when he was walking up to when he walked in, and etc. And it showed in the documentary, it shows photos. It doesn't show none of those photos of the bodies, but it shows photos of the house and how everything was. And it was just really hard to really look at in that kind of way. Jericho, Chavo, Vicky, and David, and Sandra, they all talk about how they felt when they heard the news. They just couldn't believe it. The WWE, when they were told, they ended up doing a show in memory for Chris Benoit, showing a bunch of matches and all that stuff from him. But that was really before the WWE ended up finding out the truth. And once the WWE found out the truth, we all know what happened. Vince McMahon straight up said, hey, we're not going to talk about him anymore. Basically erased him from the history books, which was, it was understandable. One of the biggest things was David and Sandra. They ended up, they said once all this stuff happened, they basically said, nobody in the WWE reached out to him. The only people who reached out to David Benoit was Chavo Guerrero and Chris Jericho, because, they were really big friends with his, they were big time friends with his dad. So they were the only two that reached out to David, who ended up, to help him through this time of everything that was going on. Because, not only did he lose his stepmom and his stepbrother, but he lost his dad, in the way that everything was portrayed in the media. Now, there was this guy named Matthew Redonzo V. If you've seen it, you know who I'm talking about, and if you haven't, so this guy basically wrote a book about the fall of wrestling. I think it was like Ring of Hell, the fall of wrestling or whatever. And he was just talking about, he was just talking negative on the whole situation, which is understandable why he did. But, whether this guy likes it or not, a lot of people aren't happy with him. I heard David Benoit on the Busted Open podcast, on the Busted Open radio show, and he was talking about, in part 2, there was some stuff that he didn't like that they put in that in that part too, and I'm guessing it had to do with this and maybe the photos that were shown, etc., because he was just like, he didn't agree with all of it. He did his best to agree with some of it, but he didn't agree with that, and I totally understand why. And basically the crazy part is to right now, to start finishing up, is they basically found 10 times the testosterone in Chris Benoit when he passed. And there was also the CTE scans that they did on him. His brain had so much damage, and it was just more information that I never really knew about until this documentary came out to confirm all that stuff. And I think it had to do with steroids, testosterone, the losing of him losing his best friend. He basically broke down after that, and he wasn't the same. And it sucked, because if that's the case, someone needs to go out, get help, and find a way to fix it. Don't just stay in your bubble or whatever the case is and lead to this big breakdown. Hopefully none of you guys ever go through that, because that's just crazy for him to end up going off the rails and causing all this stuff to happen. So if you guys haven't checked it out, you definitely should check it out. I just want to finish off with David Benoit. He was talking about everything that he had to go through, and because of who his dad was and what his dad did. I saw a lot of people were saying, hey, maybe he should change his name, drop the last name. Like, dude, that is his last name, and it sucks because he's gonna always have to deal with that adversity, whether he likes it or not. There is speculations. He says that he is interested in becoming a professional wrestler like his dad was, and a lot of people are saying, well, if he wants to do that, then he has to change his name. But on an interview that he did with Chris Van Vliet, he basically said that he wants to wear the same ring gear that his dad wore, and that he wants to use the same entrance theme, and even go by Chris Benoit Jr. I mean, if he wants to do that, that is a big risk to take. A lot of criticism is going to come with that. And yeah, I just wish him the best of luck. I think it would be awesome to see him become a wrestler. He has some big shoes to fill, not in the ending wise, but I'm talking about who Chris Benoit was as a professional wrestler. We all know that he was a really good professional wrestler. He was really good in that square circle, and those are big shoes that he would have to fill. So that's basically it. Just a small, quick little review on what to expect in here. I thought it was really well done. I learned a lot of information that I didn't know, because like I said, when this happened, I was like 8-9 years old, something like that. So I was a kid, so I didn't really know what was going on. I just from what I heard, that he killed himself, killed his wife, killed his son. That's all I heard. I didn't, and this goes into really good detail, and we learn more. And if you haven't checked it out, the links are in the description to both part 1 and part 2. So shout out to Vice TV. They did a really good job on that. And in no way was I trying to glorify what Chris Benoit did, because what he did was unforgivable. But it's definitely something worth checking out and understanding. There was a happy ending in the end between David Benoit and his auntie Sandra. They ended up reconnecting after like 13 plus years, thanks to Chris Jericho. He basically put them back in contact with each other after all that stuff happened, and they were able to come back, and I think they were at one of the AEW pay-per-views together, so that was pretty cool to see. So anyways, thank you guys. Hopefully I can get some views and stuff, and if you guys like this stuff, hopefully I can start doing more reviews. I got a lot of plans for this YouTube channel, so I want to thank you guys for clicking on this video. Hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, comment down, let me know what you guys think of the documentary, and let's have some conversations about this. All right, peace, y'all.